All right, greetings, and thanks for joining us this evening for this final MIT Starr Forum of the spring semester. My name is Evan Lieberman. I'm a professor of political science, and I direct the Center for International Studies, which is hosting this evening's event. So I'm honored to welcome to MIT two esteemed speakers, Dr. Kori Schake and Professor Juliette Kayyem, for a conversation about the US and the world under Trump, the first 100 days. So first off, yes, we are aware that Mr. Trump has technically only been in office 85 days. But we hope you'll bear with us as we're using that number 100 in a metaphorical sense. So when we started planning this event, which was actually before the inauguration, we knew that it would be important to take stock of the new president's policies and actions. But we really didn't fully appreciate how much there would be to discuss at this juncture. Indeed, given the wide-ranging and quite dramatic policy shifts coming out of Washington since January, today the country and the world feel very much transformed. This evening, our speakers will discuss the nature of those changes and their implications for all of us. And let me introduce you to them now. So our first speaker will be Kori Schake, who leads the Foreign and Defense Policy team at the American Enterprise Institute. She's the author of, among several books, Safe Passage, The Transition from British to American Hegemony, and a contributing writer at The Atlantic, War on the Rocks, and Bloomberg. Before joining AEI, Dr. Schake was the Deputy Director General of the International Institute of Strategic Studies in London. She's had a distinguished career in government, working at the US State Department, US Department of Defense, and the National Security Council. She was a senior policy advisor to the McCain-Palin campaign in 2008, and she's also taught at Stanford, West Point, and several other institutions. Our second speaker will be Juliet Cayam, who's the faculty chair of the Homeland Security and the Security and Global Health Projects at Harvard University and at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. She also serves as a senior national security analyst for CNN. She's a contributing writer to The Atlantic, has a weekly security segment on NPR's Boston station, WGBH. She served as President Obama's Assistant Secretary for Intergovernmental Affairs at the Department of Homeland Security, and before that was Massachusetts Governor Deval Patrick's Homeland Security Advisor, the recipient of many government honors. We've asked our speakers to keep their remarks to about 20 minutes. I've got my little yellow sign, which I'll flash at you, try and keep you there. Now they're looking at each other, like, but it could be less than that. Could be. All right, could be less than that, but maximum. You know, people say they're going to prepare 10 minutes, and then trust me, they go on longer. And after, they're going to join me on stage for a discussion, which I'm going to moderate, and then we'll take some questions from the audience starting at around 6:30. So you'll see we've got these two microphones, and when it's time for Q&A, we'll ask people to line up behind those. And please, if you could just ask one question at those times. We'll also be serving some light refreshments in the first floor of the lobby of this building immediately following the event. And finally, if you haven't already done so, I'd appreciate it if you would silence your cell phones. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Schake to the podium.
So I'm ordinarily the optimistic voice in any group I'm in. It's almost like a birth defect. You should pretend not to notice how optimistic I am. And I say this as a way to condition you to remember that this is the optimistic take, which is that in 85 days, I genuinely believe the Trump administration has done damage to America's engagement with the world that will take 2 generations to repair. I warned you, don't say I didn't warn you, Vipin, that starting with the economics, right? The chaotic unleashing of the tariffs have destroyed $10 trillion in value in the American economy to no obvious advantage at this point in time. And what I believe I notice about Trump administration policy is that there's not strategy. There's not an expectation of what round 2 is going to require. And what that produces is the president firing in all directions simultaneously. And that is making everything he's going to try and achieve harder to achieve. Because just to take the tariff example to start with, if you were going to put 145% tariffs on China's product because you had a policy of containing China, the United States can't do that on our own, right? It actually requires Japan, South Korea, our European allies. We have to play team sports to succeed, and by antagonizing everyone at once, President Trump is simultaneously increasing the need for cooperation while activating the antibodies against that cooperation. The secret genius of the international order that the United States and its allies crafted out of the ashes of World War II was an international order that is a macrocosm of America's domestic political order. This is what hegemons historically do. And the American political order is consensual, it's institutional, it looks for solutions that are mutually beneficial, right? Think back to Bob Zoellick's speech about the responsible stakeholder on China. That's traditional American foreign policy because it's traditional American domestic policy. And what that produced from 1945 forward was an international order that was not only beneficial to our allies, although it was intended principally to be beneficial to countries that choose democratic governance, that choose to obey the rules of international order, that is, borders change only by mutual negotiation. He is replacing that with one where the United States intends to wring every last ounce of leverage out of every negotiation we have with anyone. And so it creates disincentives for cooperation because small and middle powers typically can't protect themselves in the international order, and they can't produce positive outcomes. What the American order after 1945 produced was outcomes that weren't just good for us, that weren't just good for our friends and allies, they were even good for our adversaries, right? China becomes the economic dynamo that it is precisely because the American-led order allowed it into participation. And we allowed it into participation without having to obey the rules that everyone else is playing by. So the backlash against globalization is actually much more a narrow backlash against China's rise without China having to play by the rules that others played by. By which I mean to say, President Trump is right that there are things that need fixing, right? We have to figure out how to manage a China that is growing increasingly powerful, increasingly repressive, and increasingly aggressive. He is also correct that America's allies ought to do more for their own defense. But what he neglects to understand is that no dominant power in history has ever had as much voluntary cooperation as the United States gets from other countries. Most hegemons have to enforce their rules routinely because of the nature of the order that the United States had constructed after 1945. We very rarely have to actually enforce the rules. And that makes it a cost-effective system. And the cost effectiveness is what President Trump's very aggressive wring every ounce of American leverage out of any negotiation is creating. The second thing that is different about Trump in the first 85 days is instead of understanding that America's allies are amplifiers of American power, he views them as a drag on American power. And I can't get anybody in the administration to answer the question of how do you get to the economy of scale for managing China without help, right? If you think back, Vipin, you'll remember this, think back to the negotiations over Iran's nuclear program. The United States has had sanctions across the board on Iran since 1979. It took European, Chinese, and Russian cooperation with the sanctions to bring Iran to the negotiating table when the negotiations started. That's what we are losing internationally with the way President Trump is engaging the world. America's allies have ceased to think of us as a reliable security partner. They are genuinely worried whether we are now an adversary. The threats to allies, Canada and Denmark, the sort of 19th century bravado towards the Panama Canal, the president seems to think we can't have influence without control. And the genius of the American system after 1945 has been that we actually maximize our influence and minimize the cost by having influence without having control. Let me just end on this couple of structural problems I think the president has created for himself. The first is there are typically in the American government, there are two ways to structure a cabinet. One is Lincoln's famous team of rivals, where you pick people who have independent political standing and put them in your cabinet to create a broader social and political consensus. And it's not just Lincoln. I mean, it's President Obama putting Hillary Clinton in as Secretary of State. It's President Bush putting Colin Powell in as Secretary of State. What President Trump has, and the second model is the Biden model, which is a cabinet of staffers. And what that model does is it maximizes cohesion of the administration, but it minimizes the ability to correct policy inclinations of the chief executive, because nobody can threaten to resign and it's going to matter. What President Trump has done is a genuinely third model that I can't think of a precedent for, which is it is a cabinet of amplifiers. People who don't have independent political standing, people who they're not staffers, that is, they're not bringing ideas or competent execution of the president's desires into the administration. They're trying to figure out what the president wants and run there ahead of him. That's what Secretary Rubio's doing. That's what Secretary Hegseth's doing. That's what the Director of National Intelligence, lying under oath in a congressional hearing about whether the information in the signal leaks was classified. That's what it is. So it's not gonna get less chaotic. It's gonna continue to be like this until either public outrage begins to constrain the president or Congress begins to more effectively exercise their Article I constitutional authorities. The last thing I will say is, if you clock what President Trump said he was going to do, he was going to end the Ukraine war in 24 hours. He was going to end the war in Gaza, and he was going to turn Gaza into the French Riviera. He was going to bring Iran to the negotiating table. The only one of those things that has any prospect is the Iran piece. But remember, the other negotiations showed prospect in the first 10 days as well. Because what President Trump is good at is big ideas. What he and his administration are bad at is detailed policies that are required for execution or negotiation. So the chaos that we are seeing only gets constrained by civil society or congressional action, because the administration's not going to do it for itself. I'm done.
optimistic. Gotta put that. Can you hear me okay? Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming out. It is so great, and thank you for having us. Okay, so here we are, and we all need, I assume we're in the room to sort of give meaning or try to understand a lot of activities. So I'm going to start with a moment of Zen, of how people like me look at this world and think, and don't just want to walk out the door because it's just so hard to manage. And I come from the world, as you read, so I come from the world of emergency management and Homeland Security. And we have a phrase that or a sort of a check that we ask ourselves, like in the middle of something happening, or when I'm training people, or I'm in the room, and it's three questions: what, so what, and now what? And I wake up every morning and say that because it can be so overwhelming, and then it sort of flees by. And so what does that mean? It means what is actually happening versus what is all this madness that they sort of want you to follow, sort of to avoid a focus on actually what is the policy. And I think that gets to the line, right? That there's they don't want exposure, so they want, lots of noise. So focusing on the what. The so what is sort of what does it mean, right? Because there's lots of things that will happen and then they'll sort of come and go, or they might not be consequential to America's place in the world or to your place in the world. And then the now what is what can we do with it? I think actually you came up with it. I mean, I think that the engagement by not came up. It was just like we are at a moment where the floor hasn't dropped yet. The resistance, if you want to call it an R, to what's going on, and sort of a sense of a pushback may align with Trump's polling numbers, but I think it's wrong to think of there's a single thing. I think there's lots of activity that we have to push back on what we're seeing is happening in the world. So let me just start with a story, because it begins, I think this story begins to show you how, just not even 100 days later, how things that seem one thing have a tremendous impact in the world and the United States relationship in the world because of our previous standing. Okay, so the Trump administration begins and likely wins the election on the immigration issue. You think, oh, is that foreign policy? Like whatever, like that's just immigration. That's like that issue, right? That's the homeland issue. And comes in with a number of 1 million, that they're going to mass deport 1 million people. Well, that's super hard to do. And I think they realized it pretty early because the early numbers were not very good for the Trump administration. So they need to get numbers. So they start to do that in a way that begins to create in their mind an unlawful status for the legal immigrant. That begins with denying what's called temporary protective status to people who thought they'd be here, going after permanent lawful residents. We're seeing it at Harvard. You've seen it quite dramatically here at MIT, going after students who have legitimate legal standing, but the Secretary of State comes in and sort of gives them a designation that will be litigated in court. There's horror stories about El Salvador. But one other way that they want to do it is they want to really put pressure on the border. And that means putting pressure on the border of people who ought to come here and are allowed to come here. So in the first couple weeks of the Trump administration, it was a little bit of a trickle, but clearly I think we'll learn some memorandum goes out. That's just basically like, let's make it unfun for people to come here. And there's starting to be anecdotes in Europe, Canada in particular, but Europe also and throughout the world, that the experience of lawful vacationers and visitors to the United States is really uncomfortable. And people are getting detained for periods of time, and some people are being sent back. And it's just like not a fun experience. And then remember, this is an experience that we actually want. Right? Tourism, I want to give this example to show you. Tourism is 10%, defined largely, but 10% of America's GDP. In January of this year, the 4 major American airlines announced that they expect this to be the best year in American flying, for American airlines flying. It was there's a concept called revenge travel. It's where we all want to get on the road after COVID, and it was looking gangbusters for the airlines. But this thing that we thought was like the homeland illegal deportation, we can all have our debates about this, starts to impact the thing that actually is really beneficial for the world, which is accessibility of the United States to people to come here and see the world. The president decides to take on Canada for reasons that are just still bizarre, but also Europe through our Ukrainian policy, parts of Asia, Africa, we know he doesn't like. I mean, just basically Mexico is all a bunch of drug cartel lords. Like, basically, and guess what? The world has agency. This is what, if you were to tell me what is the Trump foreign policy, it is transactional, it is binary, and it is assumption that the world does not have agency. Right, thank you. I got it from the expert, the true expert too. It is that the world's just going to stand there and go, gosh, that's too bad. Okay, so let me start to show you the numbers. By February, right, Canadian traffic, and this is important to people in Maine and New England, but it's also important to people in Arizona and Florida. Canadian traffic is down, visitors is down 30% from what we can tell. By the end of February, 8% of what we call travel flows of Germans and French are down 8 and 9% respectively. The British still like us for some reason. Those numbers aren't budging yet, but they will. Right. The tourism industry also anticipating an uptick of 9% overall to vacationers in the United States, is now predicting a downtick of minus 18%. So now I'm talking about 10% of America's GDP. And all the benefits we get from a society that welcomes the world and vice versa, right? Because we're kind of awesome people, so it's good for other people to realize we're kind of awesome people. They're not realizing it. They are choosing not to come here, right? Now let me get to the economic parts of it. By early March of this year, Delta announces that they are not expecting, right, the revenge travel years. They are now anticipating flatlining. By the end of March, I've never seen this before in a public company in a field that I follow, which is transportation and global transportation supply chains. They actually retract their quarterly predictions for the entire year. Never seen it before. Like, they're like, we actually don't know what's happening. The numbers are clear. I say that I use this as sort of a perfect example, as a sort of idea that you can do something to other people and they have no agency to respond back, because that's what the Trump administration thinks. So let me go through areas where this is now having an impact because our allies and our enemies have agency. Signalgate looks like a big joke about Hegseth and a bunch of people putting our boss by contributing status on Signalgate. Okay, but the day 2 and day 3 stories are actually much more interesting and damning for our world order. We have an expectation with our allies, and not even our allies, that covert and classified information will be protected, in particular sources and methods. It's no joke. We have Five Eyes, we have NATO, we have other intelligence. Why is that? Why is that important? One is because we want to share intelligence, but the other is countries spend a lot of time on cultivating sources and methods to find out what's happening in other countries that may harm our interest or their interest. It's just sort of, it's like, yeah, like we all win from this. But those sources and methods are protected quite aggressively, and under the belief that both military action, the blow-by-blow that Hegseth gives on Signal, which was absolutely, let's just be clear, absolutely unnecessary for most people on that group chat to even know. Like the Secretary of State doesn't need to know what time. Like, I mean, it's like you do the action and then you tell people, right? They knew. But the other is within 2 days, there was, legitimate reporting that the Israelis were pretty mad. And the Israelis are mad. Why? Because they clearly have what we know about what happened in Yemen and the bombings in Yemen is, and this is all public, is that we allegedly, because I have to say that now, is that we allegedly got some of the senior leaders of the Houthis in apartments and other areas. We don't know what the collateral damage is, but we clearly targeted them. So if you're a terrorist organization, there are very few people who are going to know when you're visiting your girlfriend. And one of those people clearly was a source for the Israelis. So the Israelis know that their source that was giving them information has now been disclosed by the Americans to their group. Now, I don't know what happened to the source. Maybe the Israelis were able to pull him. Maybe he's dead. Right? But this is why we take our jobs seriously, because the consequences are, if you're a rational actor in this world, is you're going to tell the United States important intelligence information, not sooner, but later, for fear of that disclosure. Right? And so think what that means for our transparency of what's going on. So each of these things that seems like a joke or like something different then begins to have an impact on our own safety and security, let alone the image we have or the image that we pose to the outside world. So then third, I couldn't get out of here without mentioning Doge. So I wrote a piece for The Atlantic because I was also like what the heck is happening here, right? I was trying to figure it out. And I was trying to think about what is actually happening in terms of the world that I think about and I worry about, which is you want to avoid getting to a crisis too soon, right? The good crisis management is when you avoid the crisis, but then good crisis management is also that when it comes, you're ready. I say to my students that the crisis is defined by that the runway is short. You are either ready for it, that's the preparedness, or you try to extend the runway, right? And so that's what you're trying to do at all times in trying to avoid a crisis or be ready for it. Preparedness or be ready for the crash landing or extend the runway. So what has DOGE done in this setting? It has made America, in terms of its capacity to be ready to support other nations or stop a harm, less ready. There's no question about it, right? Whether it is what's going on at the Defense Department and intelligence gathering, to our preparedness for any kind of major disasters, right? You look at Myanmar, what happened, and we sent 2 people. We also fired them while they were there, but we sent 2 people. I mean, we used to be able to, USAID no other nation used to have that capacity at scale to minimize a harm to another nation that, if not addressed, could pose a harm to us or our allies at some stage. Yes, we're doing all this stuff for goodwill, but let's not, it's totally fine that we have a strategic security interest in it as well. Stability in the world, stability in places that might pose a mass migration to us, stability in places where the climate and climate change might cause wars over a fight for resources, stability that keeps nations from resorting to violence is beneficial to us. And we've completely abdicated that role through the soft power mechanisms that we've used. A lot of it is aid, but a lot of it is our ability to anticipate the harms that may come. We're pretending like climate change isn't happening or that climate disasters aren't happening. So I do think, in terms of, you're thinking about our strength was also in trying to minimize the harms that were going on. And what DOGE has essentially done is, through a metric of efficiency, well, let me put it a different way, because I don't believe the efficiency, that they have part of it. They are having even Democrats believe that efficiency is the only metric to judge success. And in my world, it's like kind of not really efficient. Like, it's like, you invest in things that sort of stop harms. It's hard to say that was a dollar well spent until the harm happens. But the good news is the harm didn't happen because you have invested in it, right? So it's like, this is the challenge, is if you're gonna just say, well, that's inefficient, yeah. Being ready for climate disaster in parts of the world that we care about, right? Being ready to help after an earthquake, all of that, it's hard to judge. It's hard to say that is efficient, but darn, it's a really good thing to have. And then let me end with where I think, and we picked up on it a lot, there's plenty to talk about, which is this idea that the world does not respond to the United States, right? The idea that the idea that the world doesn't have agency to respond to how we prepare, what we're doing. So I'll just end with this example then. In Myanmar, an earthquake that we think killed tens of thousands, despite what the country is saying, we sent 2 people. China, it's closer, we get it. China sent a couple hundred. China will fill the vacuum. They're not going to wait for us to assist in countries that are looking at the American experiment and in the last nearly 100 days, wondering, is that actually a model we want to emulate? And we are not able to answer affirmatively or aggressively in the affirmative right now. And that's going to be a challenge for civil society, right? For the party. It's going to be, and I'm going to be tactical and political here, it is going to be the more unpopular he becomes, the more that this image, this once was a bipartisan image of America's exceptionalism, becomes something that we can still stand behind and that we can actually get policy behind. That has deteriorated rather quickly. It will take a long time to come back. But when I say the sort of now what, the now what is the engagement. And people always say, like, what, there are a million ways to think of how you can engage right now. We don't need a single leader. We don't need a whole bunch of that. If you believe, Republican or Democrat, that the unraveling of America's strength, and not just military, in all sorts of strength in the world, is something worth protecting or rebuilding, you can begin almost anywhere. I really believe that now, because it's going to be that cacophony of noise and response. It's that will be effective, because the silence isn't, right? The hand-wringing isn't, okay? So wake up tomorrow morning, what? So what? Now what? And we'll figure this out. It is a lot, but it will be manageable. I believe that at some stage. That's my optimistic take. Thank you.
I think I'm in the middle. Great. All right. Well, thank you both for those comments. There's so many issues to dig into. And one larger question, though, for myself as a political scientist, and there are a few of you out here in the audience, we try and think, why do people do the things they do, especially when they're, drive you nuts to watch it? And I want to ask you about the tariffs issue, right? Because, right, every Economics 101 textbook will tell you the harms of putting on tariffs, especially if you're a competitive economy. We look at the history of highly protected countries, in Latin America, all these efforts, but we didn't even have infant industries to protect, right? We're a mature economy. So theory and evidence, everyone thought nuts. Yeah. And so what was the logic, right? I mean, why? Because it's obviously not just Trump. He has a set of advisors around whom we're talking. Can you walk us through, even if we're being critical of it, what was the scenario that they thought was going to play out? And they seem to be digging in and still think it is. So I don't know, do you want to start?
Yeah, I can start with it. So, I have no totally inside knowledge, but certainly people that I talked to there, and I think people in the financial world who thought he would no way do this, right? He said he was going to do it. So I think there's a couple of issues here. I really believe they were caught surprised at the world's reaction to this, and that no one blinked immediately. Like, I think Vietnam blinked, like, okay, thanks, we'll give you Vietnam. But like, I mean, I think that it's, that their perception, you know, the way you think about sort of, they're just, I love that term, that they're just amplifiers, and they have certain ideas. They will cater to his ideas. He has people on his economics team who are firm believers in this idea that America can transact its way through the global economy, and are also sort of, so that's one thing. So I think that's one. The other is, I think they are sort of confused a little bit, and that confusion led Trump to sort of put a hammer down. The sort of tech bros that are part of the administration do not believe in the world that exists now, right? It's going to be all robots, manufacturing is for losers, like all that stuff. I mean, they don't believe in the American economy in many ways. I think that's and Trump distancing himself from Musk these days, that's what they say, I think is a little bit like, well, this doesn't work outside of, you know, the compound or the rocket ship, right? And I think you see this in some of the Doge, like, you know, putting the Social Security online. And so they think that they do think that they can fix things very quickly. And that's where this tech thing comes in, that the global economy will just become a manufacturing country, right? As if that's what we should want, right? This is the same thing with efficiency. Like,
what about coal?
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
Great future in coal.
Yeah,
right?
like I was like, why would we want to become a manufacturing country for things that other countries want to manufacture, so that our people might have other skills or whatever. Like, the idea that we're going to manufacture Apple phones, even assuming that we want that, is that a desirable end, isn't going to happen tomorrow. And so I think this idea that if you just break it, it will get fixed, is sort of this animating philosophy, so that they might have gone into this knowing that it would break something, but that the remedy would come relatively quickly. That, once again, though, the world reacted quite differently than I think they anticipated. I don't believe, the doubling down, I don't believe, this is the what part? So you said they doubled down? Right, okay, so there's still tariffs out there. They're not being collected. It's a total, this is why I always focus on the what. It's like a total thing happening on headlines that has completely overwhelmed the global economy and hurt us. For what gain? From what I can tell, not much. Not much. They don't have the resources to collect the tariffs.
So the fact that the Treasury Secretary, the Commerce Secretary, the President's senior economic advisor, the head of the Council of Economic Advisors, the Commerce Secretary, and the Agriculture Secretary all gave different answers to that question, I think tells you that they don't know what they're doing. They are trying to figure out what the president is thinking and be the people who say it. My own sense is that the best way to understand the Trump administration is there's this great line by Theodore Roosevelt's daughter, Alice Roosevelt Longworth. And she said, "My father yearns to be the baby at every christening, the bride at every wedding, and the corpse at every funeral." And I think, I mean, it's funny, but I also think it's true. President Trump wants to spend his administration sitting behind the Resolute desk with a spray of journalists standing in front of him, pulling rabbits out of his hat, saying whatever he wants, and then having everybody scramble to go do it, because that need to be the center of attention is actually what's driving everything else. I mean, the tariffs, so that you have 90 different negotiations, they don't have an administration that can conduct 2 simultaneous trade agreements, much less 90. But the president wants to be the one involved in every single thing. So what you see is the complete enfeeblement of the rest of the government because nobody can speak reliably for what the president wants, and the president wants it that way.
I want to ask you both about the position of American military power at the moment. And as you mentioned, our relationships with our allies seem to be changing quite dramatically. They're not sure if they can trust us, if we really are a friend or a foe. And it seems as if, we've heard about loyalty tests within the military, so much change of turnover. I'm no expert on the US military, but just common wisdom would suggest that this would make people very antsy within a large organization. So it seemed that if we're losing some of our allies, in order to at least maintain the status quo, we will need a stronger domestic military to project the same amount of power. And I'm wondering what your view is on, and what you may have heard in terms of how the internal changes have shaped the state of the military readiness.
So I would separate the question out into two parts. One part is you are correct that if you don't have allied, not just participation, active cooperation, if you don't have the ports of Hamburg and Antwerp to ship US tanks through, if you don't have overflight rights from friendly countries, if you don't have the Landstuhl Hospital in Germany, where every American seriously wounded in the wars was taken for urgent care, if you don't have the ability to fly directly there, American power projection fundamentally relies on allied cooperation for us to be able to do things in the world. And so you're right, it's going to get a lot more expensive and a lot more difficult to try and do the things we think we can do in the world without the help of friendly allies. The other part of your question, though, is what is this doing to the American military? And lucky for you, I am an actual expert on that subject.
The reason we invited you here.
I just finished writing a history of American civil-military relations, so I'm gunned up for this one. So there are only two fundamental tests of the health of civil-military relations in the United States. The first is, can the president fire anybody he wants to? And we have just seen an extravagant exercise of that, right? The president firing the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the chief of naval operations, the senior military secretary to the Secretary of Defense. And by the way, it really matters that the president fires all those people and nobody in the military has anything to say about it.
Yeah.
That is how it's supposed to work. The American military is supposed to be politically inert, and you should want them to be. The second real test of civil-military relations in the US is, will the military carry out policies they don't agree with? And there, I think, the last 25 years, I struggle to think of a major policy in the Bush White House that I served in that the military didn't say, you guys are making a big mistake. Don't do this, please. And then we said, okay, we're going to do it, and you're going to have a third of the resources you say you need. Go do the best you can. And they go and do the best they can. That's actually how the system's supposed to work. That is how the system is working. That's one thing I don't think you should have cause for concern about.
That was terrific, and I want to add two things in how I look at the military, just given the work I do. I think there's something about the sort of anti-DEI that we sort of think it's just for its own sake, and this is like the social issue that Trump wants to have permeate throughout the Pentagon. But one of the consequences of it is, of course, getting any serious discussion about climate and climate disasters into the Pentagon. It's just basically, Hegseth has just basically said he doesn't want to hear it. Now that, as I said earlier, that has to do with disasters and disaster response and our readiness both in the homeland and abroad. But there's a third thing that we are exceptionally worried about, and I've spent a lot of time on, which is our military readiness because of climate change. Waters are rising, places are getting hotter. It is unlivable in certain places and certain months where we have our military. Tornadoes and extreme weather events in Oklahoma, where I was just a few months ago, are destroying, are implicating our Air Force. Fires in Colorado near Northern Command and NORAD have disrupted military readiness. So I do think, like, instead of thinking about it as like, oh, climate is the left-wing thing and like whatever, it is something that the military has thought about. They've been very good on this, or good in the sense that even if the lens that they were looking at it was about military readiness, that's okay. We could be self-centered, right? We could be, and that, the extent to which that is going on is a question mark, or just is it going on in a different name? Finally, we lost 3 service members yesterday and we didn't hear a beep. Yesterday or 2 days ago. Guess where they were deployed? The border. So we do have deployments going on. And this was a car accident, that's too bad. But I mean, this sort of sense of that these heavily trained service members who volunteer, happens all the time. People die on highways. People, military die in aggressive events. We know that. But it's just something to remember that there's a cost for using our military for public policy issues that should get resolved through legislation and public policy tools and the things that democratic nations generally solve public policy problems for. But if you believe that the only solution is the military, there will be consequences.
Great. Now, I know both of you are tough-minded types who work on the military and Homeland Security, and I want to ask you about foreign development assistance to poor countries, right? Which it's easy to, it's always been easy to knock foreign development assistance as being wasteful, or, is it in the American interest? We know the American public has often way overestimated how much we've spent. Yeah. But this has obviously been a huge part of the Trump foreign policy to just gut USAID and other agencies working on foreign assistance to the world's poorest countries. I think I read recently that they're thinking of closing down 1/4 of the embassies in Africa. Yeah. So, what's your take? And again, if it's an America First strategy, right? I mean, that sounds like in some sense. Does this strategy follow from the goals being espoused, or what do you see?
No, I mean, we're all going to give our sort of presidential lies. I heard someone say in Trump 1.0, I just always have to remind myself that to Trump there is no yesterday and there is no tomorrow. So there's nothing to learn from history, right? Well, just there's no like lessons learned, or like that post World War II model was pretty good of keeping us out of world wars for a long time. Like, it's like there's no, and I even remember when his son-in-law Jared Kushner was negotiating a deal in the Middle East. Whose only consequence, I think, now resounded to his financial benefit. I mean, I don't think there's a legacy to it. He literally went into the negotiations saying, I don't want to be burdened by all of these policy papers about what had happened before. Like, it viewed it as a burden. But the other thing is that there's no tomorrow. And I think part of what this strategy is that we're going to disrupt it, right? And what happens tomorrow, we'll disrupt again, or we'll figure out something. And so not taking a long approach to what are the benefits of USAID, which was imperfect, right? Everyone knew it was imperfect, but also disaster relief, vaccines and vaccine distribution, all the stuff coming out of health, right? It minimizes harms to communities that might otherwise falter, which then if they don't falter, minimizes the harms to us. It's soft power, as my colleague Joe Nye says, in terms of people feeling like we're pretty awesome people. It's like kind of good for people to feel like, whatever I think about a particular policy, America as an ideal is good, right? And then I'm going to take it a step forward because we haven't really talked about it again. But this idea that there aren't people that are impacted by what America does. I mean, I think if you look at what Trump is saying about Gaza, right? I'm not going to replay the Middle East over the last couple hundred years, but if you just look at, right, what he is saying about Gaza, development, real estate, right, as if there's not people there, right, as if people are expendable, right, that has resonance well beyond the Palestinians, right? That is this idea that people are bulk, right? You're just like in a and I've never seen language like that before. Every president knew how to at least pretend.
So I agree with Juliet that foreign assistance is a trivially small part of the American foreign budget. What we spend on foreign assistance is small relative to the operations. It's small relative to the defense budget. And there are some dumb things in there.
Yeah.
But in general, it is a way to help solve problems that free up governments to help us solve our problems. I do a lot of work on building coalitions when I'm in government. And after September 11th, when we went out to capitals all over the world asking for assistance, quite a number of countries wished they could spend their time on the kind of problem we were spending our time on, because they actually had bigger problems than we had. And so one of the ways that foreign assistance is advantageous to the United States is that it shows that we're willing to help other countries solve the problems that they are concerned about, and that frees them up and inclines them towards helping us to solve the problems we care about.
Great. So I have one last question before opening up to the audience, which is, why are we not seeing more pushback from senators and representatives? I get that several of them came in, recently as part of the Trump wave, but many of the Republicans are career representatives, public servants, and they know better, right? But they're not speaking up. And I think a lot of us, based on that applause, based on the book by Ziblatt and Levitsky, Tyranny of the Minority, wondering what's going on. So wondering if you have any views.
I do have views on that subject. And I think in particular, my fellow Republicans are doing a disservice to the country by not more aggressively doing what Congress is supposed to do, which is authorize activity by the executive and appropriate the funds for it, and demand that you constrain executive power. The system's designed for Congress to be dominant in the American system. And the amount of their constitutional authority they are ceding to the president, they're not going to like it when somebody who doesn't share their political views has the power they are ceding to the president. That's John Rawls' theory of, the veil of ignorance, that you set rules based on not knowing who's going to be in charge. And Republicans are failing the country, I think. In their defense, many of them argue, and justifiably, that the president got elected, he won all 7 swing states, he won the popular vote, he has a right to try and carry out the policies that he did campaign on. And one thing I will say in President Trump's support is that he does actually say what he's going to do. It's not a surprise that he said this is what he's going to do, and he still won the popular vote, and he still won the 7 swing states. So Republicans are deferential to a Republican president. But I also think we begin to see buds of what could become blossoms of congressional activism. I mean, that Senator Collins sent a bipartisan letter to the president threatening him over the impoundments clause is pretty interesting, given the number of times she has not responded to things the president has done. Lindsey Graham leading a bipartisan effort to continue aid to Ukraine based on using seized Russian assets. On a bipartisan basis, Senator Reid and Senator Wicker, the chair and ranking on armed services, insisting that the president needed to investigate the signal business. And the last one, what was the last one? There's at least one more. As I said, I'm the optimistic one. I believe we can see buds that could blossom, but it's going to actually take a lot of public pressure, a lot of us saying what you are doing is actually not good for the country, and holding our members of Congress accountable.
I would just add to that, because I do start to see buds. I mean, part of that is going to be, I don't know how verifiable it is, but whatever you think of Chuck Schumer, he has a theory of the case, which is that if you get the president to closer to 40%, the Republicans will wake up. And so he doesn't want the Democrats to be terribly noisy right now. Now, you can agree or disagree, and some are noisy, but that's the theory of the case. And as the president becomes more and more unpopular, some of it's pocketbook issues, some of it is just people are being reminded, like, it's just not fun to have to think about the White House all the time, right? I have a new rule. I don't scroll, after 6 p.m. because it just like infiltrates me and I can't sleep. Like, I'm not kidding. Like, I have to sort of amend myself too. And some of it is because the scrolling is just not meaningful use of my time. So part of that is just looking at how popular or unpopular the president is. Will have the Republicans will begin to fill, in the same way that I described the Chinese and other nations, like begin to fill that vacuum. It's not going to come from the cabinet or pushback on the cabinet. If you want a theory of the cabinet besides amplifiers and enablers, about half of them want to be J.D. Vance's vice president. Okay. I mean, people say, like, why did the Attorney General do that? Why did the Secretary of Homeland Security do that? Like, why did Marco Rubio, I have an answer for you. And so we need to start being like, instead of wringing our hands, we're like, that's exactly why they're doing it. What can I do to counter it? The wringing of the hands is like, we know why. So that's one reason for the Republicans. But then this is my call to maybe a lot of people who are in the room, which is, he didn't just win the election, the other side lost the election decisively. And we maybe should spend a lot of time thinking about what are the stories we need to tell from whatever perch you're in, to your friends and colleagues or whatever, if we have larger perches, about why government matters in people's lives, why competent governance matters for America. The American public, you can hate, you can live here and say, like, who are these people? 50% of our citizens plus voted for Donald Trump. And so they feel something in him that maybe you don't in this room. And I think beginning to give an alternative narrative of why government working and why America not in chaos is good for the world is a start. So it's on us too.
I'll just say we also need to tell the story of why universities matter for
We
America.
did it. I mean, I have to say, just going to Harvard, that's what I was saying earlier. I was like, I feel like I've been holding my breath that someone finally institutionally is pushing back. It's going to be a fight. We're going to concede some things. It's not going to be, but it is. it gives an alternative pathway for institutions to think about what are your values. And I think if you look at the university where I teach, Harvard University, we spent 2 years since the beginning of the Israeli Hamas war, letting others define the experience and the meaning of the institution. And those people weren't even on campus. And so it just felt really good to have an institution defend the values. It makes the employees, that's all I am, is I'm an employee of an institution, feel like I'm ready to help, right? And that I think in all of our ways we can be ready to help.
Great. Well, I want to invite people from the audience to ask questions. If you could line up behind the microphones, and again, really to ask a question, and just one of them. I'll point to you over here for the first question.
How will adversaries take advantage of the Trump administration?
I think there are manifold ways that if I were an American adversary, I would see a range of vulnerabilities. I mean, one is just let us keep making the mistakes that we are making and not get in the way. But, President Trump, if you think back to the negotiations with North Korea in the first Trump administration, remember President Trump was going to solve this problem immediately. He had this great relationship. We not only got nothing in the negotiations, but North Korea continued its nuclear weapons development. So we're in an objectively worse place. I think adversaries are going to do what the Russians are doing, which is, sure, we'll negotiate. And our demands are no armaments in Western Europe. And let's talk about that until the end of time, while poor Ukraine continues to be targeted by Russia. So buying time, giving big, exciting meetings that produce nothing, because President Trump actually has no follow-through on policies. He just has the event. So 2 ways. I am genuinely concerned about the sovereignty of Taiwan because of the way the president has been talking about it, and people that the president has nominated for senior positions talk about it as though China has a natural right to a sphere of influence, and countries have no inherent rights of their own. I genuinely worry that the president that China's premier will be smart enough to offer President Trump a great big trade deal if he turns aside Taiwan.
I have nothing.
Okay, great.
Yeah, we'll keep going.
This might be an interesting question. Where do I start? Simon Cowell and Mr. Wonderful. They are notoriously famous and popular. And the basis for it was because they were so crude, vulgar, put down of others. And they liked them. Why? It might have something to do with, I haven't kept statistical evaluations for the last 12 years or so, but among the most mistrusted professions in America, the top 3 highest are politicians, lawyers, and used car salesmen. You don't really believe you're going to negotiate and say, of course, yes, we're going to do that. And what happens? A lot doesn't get done. And I think the appeal to Donald Trump is that he says things like Mr. Wonderful does, and Simon Cowell said, and people go, wow, I feel like I can trust him. Can he be trusted? He's crazy in many ways. I go to a monthly meeting of neuropsychiatrists, and one of the questions asked is, how many of you, this was 2014, I said, how many of you think that Donald Trump has a clinical problem? All of them went up. Despite that, there's that feeling of maybe something dramatically different, because we don't know how good government is, really. The average American doesn't really think they're sparkling. Maybe we
Do you have a
need
question
something which
for
is
our
different.
panelists?
Thoughts on that rather unusual question, statement, is what I'm fascinated with what you're going to say.
I think I have no particular insight into that.
Yeah, I think no. I think just one thing is the institutions that push back against the cruelty will not only look good by historical standards, but will be in a better position than those that fold to the cruelty.
In the time of Roosevelt, the public had patience that he would take care of the problems of the Great Depression. Now, the public has the attention span of a TikTok video. So my fear is that we've gotten into a state of a wild pendulum from red to blue, from red to blue. I was wondering about your views of whether you see that happening into the future.
So I think the American political system is pendular and tied incredibly tightly by design to public attitudes. And the only way to prevent pendular swings like that is legislation that passes on a bipartisan basis in Congress. I mean, the American system's designed to do nothing until you win the political argument. And right now, we are so narrowly balanced between the two political parties that only bipartisan work is going to be enduring, I think.
I think that's right.
Hello, enjoying your talk. How would you respond to someone who says that America should step back and become more isolationist and project less power, asking for a friend? Thank you.
Is your friend sitting in the front row?
No, I think so. I just like, this is there aren't only untruths about Donald Trump. I mean, he reflects, I think, important elements of debates that have been going on in national security and homeland security issues for a long while. I mean, I've said it publicly, right? You know, just one sliver in the world I'm in is like, the Biden administration should have been more like the Trump administration on some immigration stuff. It's just clear to me. Like, it wasn't that we lost the argument, we lost the policy. So there are important elements that I think are ways that we should think about our engagement, whether it's at the right time. But I can't answer that question because you're asking me to separate this theory from the reality that I see. If I actually thought that, settling in Ukraine had anything to do about our isolationism rather than some weird thing between him and Putin, I would say, okay, let's have that discussion. With this administration, I cannot separate the policy from maybe a good policy idea from the execution. I just can't. And they don't want you to.
If I could jump in real quick.
Yeah.
I think on the issue of foreign assistance, one potential bright spot, and we won't know for a while if it will be bright, is, for a really long time, poor countries have said, we don't want this foreign assistance. We don't want these dependent relationships. We know that a lot of money has been used incredibly well. PEPFAR and the President's AIDS program, incredibly
Millennium
important.
Challenge.
But a lot hasn't. And so I think the shakeup has some potential for governments to stand on their own and say, we got to figure out how to do this the right way and without assistance. Yeah. No one would have done it the way it was done by Trump, but I think there might be
I always think that he reflects some interesting aspect of a debate that's been ongoing. No one in that world would have thought this is the model we want to continue forever.
So the problem with that approach is that it relies on other countries making the choices we would want them to make in absence of our participation. And I think that happens a lot less often than the theory imagines. You have to be comfortable with others setting the rules that are going to govern our participation if we're not setting and enforcing the rules. If you think spheres of influence are fine and you don't care whether Japan and South Korea negotiate an exclusive trade arrangement with China, which they have just started negotiating as a response to the tariffs, then great. My guess as to what the US stepping back produces is a lot more chaos for countries that can't protect themselves or can't protect their economies from predation. Rules and organizations that the US is excluded from and that are hostile. Think supply chain security that doesn't run through the United States. The exorbitant privilege of running federal deficits of trillions of dollars because the dollar's the holding currency of the international economic order. That is tied to America being willing to engage in the world to set and enforce rules. And so stepping back might produce all sorts of great benefits, but are you willing to bet your security and prosperity on that? A lot of people who favor less American involvement in the world get very frustrated that even presidents like President Obama, who run on that argument, never actually do it when they're in office. And the reason they don't do it is because they become persuaded that the disadvantages outweigh continuing to participate in an international order that has made us safe and prosperous.
If the U.S. continues down the non-democratic path of 1930s Italy, 1970s Chile, and Argentina, what point do the remaining democratic countries start to form an alliance to contain us and oppose us and eliminate the problem that we have put in power?
I think it's a really important question, and I don't have a good sense of where that tipping point would be. But I do think you already begin to see, for example, when the United States chose to no longer participate in the monthly Arms to Ukraine meetings. We also didn't get invited to the meetings of military chiefs about how to deal with the war in Ukraine. So I think you begin to see countries realizing that we are not going to be helpful. And so they have to figure out how to not just do without us, but shield their efforts from our efforts. Yeah. So I think you can see traces of it already.
They have agency.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Thank you for your presentations. The issue du jour, which is most important and concerning to me, of course, is this notion that's been going on of the administration attempting to disappear people to different countries, in particular El Salvador, coupled with the active disobedience of lawful court orders compelling them to stop and to reverse the actions. What do you think is going on, and where is this all going to lead to?
I want proof of life right now.
Me too.
I thought that was a conspiracy theory a couple of days ago, but I can't quite understand why this would be the constitutional issue that you would go to war with the Supreme Court on. They've already admitted the error. The president of El Salvador and Donald Trump won't lose any support for getting him out of there. And they would have looked like big men. And I thought, honestly, I thought this would be over. I've been obviously very focused on this issue. The polling is not particularly good for the president. It's actually quite bad on both the idea of disappearing people who you admit were the wrong people, the focus on not the bad people, right? So if you say generically, do you want criminals out of this country? Everyone is yes, right? Absolutely. Like, criminal, documented criminals, absolutely. Like, well, you'd be an idiot to say, like, right, absolutely, you want them out of this country. That's not what's happening across the board, as we're seeing, and it's not a good look for the Trump administration. So I am very much focused on this case. Something is up with this case that I can't figure out. So I think it's legitimate as an analyst to say, is he alive? right? Is that, I don't think that's a conspiracy. Is he alive? And we have a senator down there right now who has not answered that question either. Okay, on the bigger issue of the disappearing, don't give up on the courts yet. The Supreme Court, despite what Stephen Miller said, did 9-0 say you've got to get a process of matter. This might be readdressed by the Supreme Court, and you have a process of contempt beginning in against the lawyers. People will be fined money. People will then have to go to jail. This is how contempt proceedings here. We are at hardball, and we need to play it. This is the untouchable. If this one goes, I mean, and this is why I don't understand. Why would you pick this case, right? This case is not very sympathetic. Pick the guy who killed 20 people, and you disappear. But so something is interesting going on. But the due process elements that J.D. Vance and Trump are sort of like playing with, we still have courts that across the board, it's a massive losing streak for the administration. Even the court cases, the court cases that you hear may be losses tend to be immigration courts. We should assume that they would be losses. Those will now be addressed in federal court. So that's all I have to say. I mean, but I await the senator's assessment that he's still alive, and I hope he is.
Thank you.
Specifically on economic policy, there's a relatively recent example in the UK of a leader who came into office, enacted a series of disastrous policies, and in fewer days than Trump has already served, she was left office and those policies were reversed. So does the fact that not only approval in terms of approval ratings, but in terms of real-time market negative reaction to Trump's policies, does this in fact reflect a vulnerability in our system that there isn't a clear way to reverse course when an administration decides to take these sort of actions that are reacted to so negatively, both in terms of public opinion and the markets?
Should we become a parliamentary system?
I forgot her name.
Liz Truss.
Thank you.
Yeah.
No, I think the rambunctiousness of the American body politic is well served by the stabilizing function of fixed term in Congress and in the presidency.
Yeah.
But of course, there is a remedy, which is impeachment. And if I were betting on the coming 3.5 years, I think it likelier than not that because of the chaotic choices of the Trump administration, that you will see a Democratic wave in 2026 and probably a third impeachment of President Trump.
Yeah.
But, I mean, do you think, can we at least say that the backtracking on tariffs is a reaction to public opinion? I mean, you could, from one perspective, maybe it's purely seeing what happened in the markets, but presumably public reaction against it caused some of this change, and that's a good sign for democracy.
Yes, but I would caution you that assuming there is a logic trail in Trump administration policy, we tend to we want to impose order on something that is fundamentally more chaotic than it is orderly.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So I have a question about crisis readiness as far as domestic policy is concerned. I'm actually having difficulty framing the question because of the unprecedented nature of the moment that we find ourselves in. But let's just hypothetically say we hit a tipping point. However it is that you define that. The courts are ignored. Political people are being arrested off the streets. Americans are being disappeared. The suspension of habeas corpus. My question is, are you aware of conversations happening outside the media, preparing for that moment, leadership preparing for that moment, whether it's a government in exile or some sort of strategic approach to when and if that happens? And it looks more and more likely that will happen. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I understand, and I hear this. So it's bad. It's not that bad. And I think we have to remember that we are showing resiliency in ways. I mean, part of it is that the American public does matter, and protest matters, and bad economies matter, and elections still matter. They may not, and questions about whether, they're free and fair is what we're focused on. But so let me just say, sort of America was built essentially in a way that makes 50 states relevant. And so to remember that, right? I mean, remember that there are other governance structures that are going to be meaningful in the years ahead. And to engage with them and buttress them and try to change the pool. I mean, we're in a blue state or whatever. I think this is what's interesting about what AOC and Bernie Sanders are doing and where they're showing up and stuff. But I don't know how this ends, but it doesn't end with some alternative vision. Either this is who we are, right? And the system was not as great as we thought it was, or the system is showing buds that maybe blossoms, huge losses for the president, a legal track record I wouldn't want, right? I mean, there's still things to support, but there's scenario playing around what would happen if X, Y, or Z, but this alternative, no. I mean, this is how we're built.
So you're an optimist.
I think you have to, don't give up on us. Honestly, if you think the only solution is I'm going to be completely freaked out, or I'm not talking about you. I'm just I call them, the moms who have my phone, like my girlfriends. I'll be like, I'm on a run. I'm on the Peloton. Leave me alone. They'll be like, I just saw this, and it's like, the more that we cannot play into, and I don't mean it don't be nervous. There's lots of bad things going on, but also to remember that we as citizens still have agency too. Lots of bad stuff happening. I don't like it, but the mechanisms to push back on it are still vibrant, and we can believe it. And so no, yes, I'm an optimist, and I believe that we need to narrate better about why this country is worth defending.
Just a quick follow-up in terms of
Sorry,
crisis.
we don't have time for a follow-up. We've got two. We're going to just ask the two. We'll take both questions right now and give you each a chance to have a last word.
All right, thank you for being here. So U.S. has a lot of military presence around the world, in Korea, in Japan, and in Germany as well. President Trump talks about retracting those military bases back to the U.S. And a lot of times I think about the U.S. military in those regions provides stability for that region as well. So what would retracting that military back into the U.S. lead to? Would that lead to an arms race back into the Cold War era? Because the Japanese and the Koreans, they do have the ability to create nuclear weapons in the matter of a few months, and they're not doing it because of the presence of the U.S. and the belief in the U.S. system. So I just wanted to, ask you about what would happen if all of those retractions do happen.
Great, and we'll take your question too now.
Hi, thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Is the unfettered access by DOGE to government workers' private details and Americans' data a concern for security?
Yes. Yes.
Jill,
I think DOGE is is such a failure of epic proportions, even by its own metrics, on efficiency, and which if you I'm pretending like that's what it's about. That vulnerability is real, and it gives access to not only DOGE, who I view as an enemy of the state, but also foreign governments from having access. And look, I mean, there's going to be consequences to this, in the sense something will happen, and we will begin to see not only the failures of DOGE, but I think it is probably one of the most corrupt aspects of what's going on. I think that story of DOGE and its absolute corruption has yet to be told as fully as sort of the personality of Elon Musk.
I agree with that judgment. On the consequences of withdrawing U.S. forces, to use a European example, the interim political guidance that the Secretary of Defense has issued to the department outlines China as the principal threat and advocates for the drawing down of U.S. troops in Europe, and says that we will substitute for troops by extended nuclear deterrence. The problem with that is, first of all, it might not be acceptable to allies. Second of all, it is harder to make that deterrent credible without the presence of U.S. military forces. And I think you see that in the discussions in particular in South Korea about their concern about U.S. reliability and the desirability of crossing the nuclear threshold. I think, but nuclear proliferation to allies isn't the only cause for concern. I think the other concern is allies making the opposite choice, which is the enfeeblement of their own security in order to try and reduce the threats to them. South Korea is one of the best examples of how the post-World War II order allowed the flowering of a society into peace, prosperity, and glorious cultural products. And so meddling with that is a costly enterprise to engage in.
Great. I want to remind you we have a reception, some light refreshments downstairs on your way out if you want to continue the conversation. Thanks to all of you for coming this evening, and please join me in thanking our two speakers.
Thank you.